So as you can probably tell from the difference between the program you have in front of me and the slide up on the board, I am presenting a different paper. The paper I was going to present is sort of in its final stages, and instead I wanted to use the opportunity to sort of fly a kite with a paper that we're just beginning some work on, and to get some feedback on it. So this, the data collection for this, as you can see, the data collection was done with Welsh health and social care workers. The data collection was originally part of a report that we're writing commissioned by the trade union Unison, which covers health and social care workers in the National Health Service and in local authorities in Wales. The union was primarily concerned with the impacts of governmental austerity on working time and work intensification. But what sort of emerged while we were talking to workers, whenever we asked them about work intensification, they said to us, well, yeah, some of it's understaffing, some of it's government cuts. A lot of it is this proliferation of administrative labour that we're having to do. And they said that for them that was really a theme that emerged pretty organically. Like I said, we're in the very early stages. We've just done 9 interviews on the back of a survey that we did, but I'll be presenting data today from those first 9 interviews. A very quick look at the literature. There's a reasonably well-developed literature on the proliferation of administrative labour in the British and other public services, generally associated with new public managements over the last 3 or 4 decades. A lot of the studies in this, looking at this, come from sort of the public administration or public management fields, and tend to look at this through the lens of efficiency and effectiveness. What is this doing to services? Is it making services better? There is a more industrial relations sort of literature on it, primarily in the education sector, and there's some really good studies of the higher education sector and the proliferation of administrative labour there. But these tend to conceptualise this phenomenon and worker resistance to it as a kind of creeping Taylorism, that in these parts of the public sector, it's an effort to sort of measure the increase in paperwork is an effort to measure, evaluate, and ultimately rationalise and standardise the labour process. I want to argue today that if we look at this issue through patterns of managerial indulgency, so in other words, informal patterns of management leniency towards certain types of worker resistance, we can see that this isn't actually about increasing control of the labour process or improving efficiency, but actually about a transfer of accountability and responsibility from the service and on to the individual worker. So just start with a few, you can see a few quotes on the board from workers describing the proliferation of paperwork in their sector. Once again, these emerged really organically. My original sort of questions that I went into these interviews to ask had nothing about administrative labour, but the workers just, as soon as I started asking them about work intensification and their working hours, this is what they wanted to talk about. Interestingly, and contrary to a lot of the recent literature, which suggests that this re-bureaucratisation or audit explosion has either reversed or slowed in recent years, the union members I've been talking to have actually said that it's accelerated over a recent period of time. You can see this nurse here, who's been on the job for 4 years since she graduated, and told me, well, essentially the administrative labour has become much more laborious, much more of her time is now spent on administrative labour rather than on actually giving social or health care. So we shouldn't be surprised if workers are being taken away from what they see as their core tasks, which is a really important aspect of this. They see their core task as giving health and social care. It's also contributing to their stress and to their work intensification, that workers have developed certain mechanisms of resistance or avoidance. 1 or 2 workers told us that they just ignore the paperwork, they don't do it. This was a rare response, and we'll talk about why it was rare in a minute, but it did happen. The majority of workers described to me engaging in what I'm calling tick boxing. you see here, I don't pay much attention, I just fill it in and get on with things. And I had a lot of workers describe to me how they could go through a piece of paperwork in 30 seconds when it's supposed to take 10 or 15, and they just get it done, and then they get on with what they see as their core tasks. In addition to sort of these patterns of resistance, there was also some flat-out consent. You see this nurse here who told me, I want to be a really good nurse, but you've got to get on with your writing. In other words, workers saying, well, I'm not as good at my job as I could be because I've got to spend so much time on this administrative labour. Conspicuously absent was any sort of trade union resistance or organised resistance to administrative labour. And it struck me because this is what workers wanted to talk about when they were talking about their working conditions, and you know, British trade unions, partly because of historical reasons and institutional reasons, have traditionally focused on matters of pay and conditions rather than on work organisation. And that very much was reflected in when I asked all the people who I'm interviewing are union members and asking them about this and saying, well, why hasn't the union done anything about it? And they really didn't see it as within the union's purview to do something about this issue. So, patterns of managerial indulgency. Again, I'm taking this from Goodner, who described patterns of an indulgency pattern essentially as an informal sort of pattern of worker management relationship in which leniency is given to certain kinds of worker resistance or misbehaviour because it's seen as ultimately being in management's best interest. So tick boxing was generally indulged and often even encouraged by management. We had workers describing to me when they went to management to complain about how much paperwork they had to do, they were told to engage in tick boxing. You know how to fill in this form, learn how to do it quickly, don't pay any attention to it, and get on with the real job. Workers even felt that sometimes they were encouraged or indulged with management when they ignored what they considered, or what we might consider the core tasks of a social or healthcare worker, in order to prioritise their administrative labour. This quote here from a home care worker: management seemed to be more concerned with paperwork than doing the actual work. And this, I'll come back to this, but this was reflected in a lot of the interviews. One thing that wasn't indulged in any of my interviews was not doing the paperwork. Management was very strict on this. This is my favourite example of this. This was a nurse in a hospital in North Wales who told us that there was a new piece of paperwork brought into the ward which consolidated two previous pieces of paperwork that they were doing for each patient on the ward. And so the workers naturally stopped completing the redundant pieces of paperwork once this new piece of paperwork was brought in. A few months later, the NHS auditors came around and each of the workers were dragged in one by one for interviews to ask them why the ward wasn't completing the redundant pieces of paperwork. And so here you have an example of actually workers taking initiative, control of the labour process to make it more efficient and provide a better service, and actually being punished for it because the managerial concern was not on what work was being done, but how that work was being represented by the labour force. So, like I said, we're in very early stages, and this has been sort of an evolving idea in my head over the last week or two. But I think that we're in a position where we can start to draw some very preliminary conclusions about what's going on. First of all, I think this is an important part of it. I don't think this is about, for management, this is about a struggle for control of the labour process in the first instance. What actually we found was, especially workers engaging in tick boxing, that actually they had more autonomy over their labour process than they might have otherwise, because all that management was concerned with was that paperwork. So they then actually were largely unsupervised in the rest of their labour process. Instead, workers frequently, when I asked them, so what's this about? They said it's about the transfer of accountability and responsibility onto us. And you can see here, this is about covering the organisation's backside. I could paraphrase this quote from 3 or 4 of the interviews we've done so far. It's not if it's not written down, it's not done, right? So the importance of representing their labour. In one interview, the worker actually told me, just because it's being written down doesn't mean it's being done. And I think when you put those two quotes next to each other, you kind of get to the paradox that I'm trying to outline here a little bit. So, in conclusion, I think the proliferation of administrative labour appears more geared towards workers, obliging workers to represent their labour in a certain way that makes management able to transfer accountability for those services onto them, rather than a power grab for control of the labour process or anything about improving efficiency, despite what management might say. So, thank you very much.